This video is to give you an overview of the Civil War so that we can spend much more of our class time talking about the consequences in the Reconstruction period. So we're going to go through this relatively quickly. One thing that we need to understand is that the difficulty with which both the Union and the Confederate armies mobilize is going to get bigger as the war goes on. So in the early stages of the war, there's that sort of feeling of excitement on both sides, and it's much easier to recruit soldiers. This is particularly true in the South because it was the South that initiated the war because they started to secede. And so there are many young men in the South who feel that by joining the Army, they're fighting for those states' rights, they're fighting for the right to own slaves. And there were more people in the North that felt more detached from the war. This was particularly the case in urban areas and among the working class because to them, they were working some of the hardest and lowest paying jobs. And they actually, many of them feared the end of slavery because they thought it would make the market even more competitive. So like you see here, in the early year, the first year of the war, you had that sort of excitement phase where many people are willing to join the military. And then by a year or so, when it becomes quite clear that the war is not going to be a very fast conflict, you start to see that it's more difficult to recruit soldiers. So there are going to be certain incentives that the government is going to introduce, like paying soldiers a little bit more money if they enlist in the Army. You're also going to see, when we get to the Union specifically, the War Department is going to be strengthened. You're going to see that it will be easier for the Union Army because it is operating under a centralized government to gain more soldiers, to also, of course, have more access to weapons and supplies because the North has more industrialization. But even with those measures, it's very difficult for the Union to keep their military full in size. And so halfway through the war, Lincoln's going to issue the Militia Act, and this is going to allow Lincoln to call up additional militias for service. So this basically means that he can strengthen the number of soldiers he has that much more. And then what's really telling is in the last 2 years of the war, you're going to see the introduction of conscription, which is another word for a draft. So this really shows us how difficult it is for both sides to maintain soldiers if they actually resort to forcing people to join the Army. So we actually are going to revisit this slide when it's filled in a little while. I'm going to show you a series of graphs and charts in the next few slides for us to really flesh out what the North had going for it, what the South had going for it, and the things that were putting them at a disadvantage. We do this when we talk about almost all wars. We've definitely talked about it with the Revolutionary War. So the first chart I want to draw your attention to is just raw, crunchy numbers, statistics. Notice the difference in population. To be a little bit more specific, the North has a population of about 22 million on the brink of war, and the South's population by comparison is about 9 million, and 4 million of those in the South were slaves. You also just see in terms of capital, the North has much more money available within its banks. Many more people are investing in banks, which means that money is going to be available for more military expenditures, right? Because banks, of course, use the money that people deposit to loan out for other services. You also see that the North is much more industrialized. So look at the difference in terms of how many factories, percentage-wise, are located in the North. One very clear area where the North was at a disadvantage was that it had virtually no cotton industry, and the South completely dominated the cotton industry. So because of the developing textile industry in the North, they did still very much depend on the South for cotton. So that was one of the, I guess, crutches that the North had to deal with, right? You know, ultimately, they had to realize that their textile industry might be placed on hold while they have restricted access to the cotton industry of the South. You also see that the North has more food, which is really important for, of course, just maintaining an army. They have more horses, which is significant for military supplies. The South has more donkeys and mules, but those are not really effective for military purposes, more just for carrying cargo. And then even more importantly, and we're going to look at another chart in just a minute to show you this on a map, look at how many more railroads are located in the north. This also means that when it comes to transporting supplies from one battle location to another, the South is going to have a really, really serious disadvantage there. Okay, so in terms of population, just notice some of the patterns that we see here. So first off, notice that in the slave states, the black population is about 1/3 of the total population of the South. So that means that that whole portion of the population is ineligible to enlist in the military. So, we already said that the population in the South is less than half of that in the North, but then when you add to it that 1/3 of that population is enslaved, that shows us that the South is at an even greater disadvantage because so many of their soldiers can't actually fight in the army. Another thing that's really significant is that you have a very different kind of population pattern. You have many more urban people living in the free northern states and many more rural people living in the southern states. So ultimately, that kind of connects actually back to transportation because we are more industrial in the north. There is much more technology at the North's disposal. The urban population is a little problematic in other ways, though, in the North, and we're going to see that when we talk about the New York City draft riots, for example. And here's another visual that shows you all the railroad lines that exist in the North, and by contrast, look at the railroad lines that exist in the South. Another thing to keep in mind is that the different colors of these railroad tracks are significant. If you look at this chart here, it shows us that the railroads are different gauges. So that means that not all railroad cars can actually ride on the same track. Notice that all of the gauges in the north, for the most part, are colored in red. So that means that most of the railroad gauges are standardized. So for example, if you have a train leaving from New York and it's traveling along one of these red labeled tracks, it can easily get all the way to these western locations without having to change from one train to another. By contrast, notice that the South, most of their railroad tracks are a completely different gauge. So that means that it's very difficult for the South to have any sort of ability to exchange supplies when it gets to farther northern territories. And this is even more important because some of the earliest battles in the Civil War lay north of most of these railroad tracks. Many of them were in this area because the North was trying to seize Richmond. And so it's very difficult for the Southern soldiers in the very early stages of the war to get supplies because the gauges change. All right, other things. We notice that the workforce is much stronger in the North than in the South. Just notice also the industrialization, also just the sheer wealth. Railroad tracks we already discussed. Textiles, of course, the North is much stronger, but we also know that the North has no supply of cotton as a natural resource, so that's a huge disadvantage. In terms of weapon supplies, the North is at a huge advantage as well. So the South either has to industrialize quickly to start making its own weapons, or it needs to maintain a good relationship with European countries so that it has access to weapons. So the South is really playing upon Europe in the early stages of the war by continuing to export cotton to them in hopes that these European countries will ally with the South. Now that works for a while, but we're going to see how that changes eventually. So I told you that we were going to revisit that slide before and fill it in with some details. So just as a recap, the advantages of the North, right? It has a much higher population, 22 million. Whereas down here you see that the South's population is 9 million and 4 million of those people are slaves. The North has a very, very significant technological and industrial advantage over the South. So to be more specific, in terms of railroad tracks, in terms of telegraph wires, in terms of numbers of factories, all these things are going to allow the North to be much more productive in a military capacity. The North also, because it has a much stronger centralized government, can organize its bureaucracy in a way that it can raise money for the war much more effectively without having as much conflict with the states. So even though there aren't as many people who are willing to enlist in the army in the North, the way that the Northern government is organized makes it easier for them to just be prepared for war. So they're going to strengthen their War Department pretty significantly as the war starts. And what this is going to cause is an unprecedented amount of mobilization in the North. The Union's going to find new ways to raise funds as well. This is one of the first times that they sell bonds to individuals. A bond, it's like a savings bond, if you're familiar with that. Ultimately, what you do is you pay a amount of money to be issued a bond by the government. That money eventually you will get back and it will mature to be worth more. So eventually, what it means is you're putting money into the federal government. The federal government can spend that immediately, but later you get something back with interest because you lent money to the government. So there's an incentive for individuals to do it, and it also really helps the northern government for gaining money. The North also has a navy. The South really doesn't have much of a navy to speak of at all. But the North has many disadvantages that we tend to give less attention to, and I think that that's really a shortfall when we study this history, right? First of all, despite the fact that the North has a higher population, not as many people in the North are really excited about the prospect of going to war. First of all, they have, well, one could say they have less investment in it because in many ways the real tension that arises surrounding the war is the slavery question. And so since so many people in the North don't own slaves, they don't really feel like they have any sort of investment in going to war. Another thing that we mentioned earlier is that because there's such a higher industrial economy in the North, you also have a huge working class. And the working class is actually threatened by the end of slavery because they would feel that they would actually face even more competition for their jobs. And this is very telling when we look at the New York City draft riots in 1863. So this is mainly actually Irish immigrants or second generation Irish Americans who do not want to be drafted into the military because they see it as a war to free the black men. And they argue that they don't have enough rights to be fighting for enslaved people, right? So they actually revolt against the U.S. government, and it shows us how really the North is not particularly unified about the war cause. So even though the North had a nice budget to raise a military, it didn't have the same kind of military leaders that the South had, and we'll talk about some of the key leaders, particularly people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. It takes a while for the North to have similar, I guess, military heroes and leaders. The other thing is that the North is arguably more on the offense, and they're facing a huge territory that they have to conquer. And also it's a territory that they don't know, so they don't have the home court advantage. The South has that, on the other hand, right? They are fighting for their homeland. They are more familiar with the ins and outs of the land. They know how to get around. So ultimately, that does serve as an advantage for them. Like I said earlier, the South also has really strong military leaders. Many of them, interestingly, were actually educated in northern military academies like West Point. The South also has the war spirit, right? Since secession was started by the southern states, many of them feel like they have more to lose, and they kind of have that general war spirit. They're excited about fighting for their own freedom. And so that goes a long way, and that encourages many Confederates to enlist in their military. But the South has tons of disadvantages, and these tend to be emphasized more, actually, when we study this. So the South, as we said earlier, does not have the same type of industrial development as the North, right? So if they don't have factories, it's harder for them to produce weapons and other military supplies. So they're going to have to rely on countries like France, England, to get weapons. So they have to make sure that they have a positive relationship with those countries. Another thing, again, is the population, which we already discussed. And also, since the Confederate States of America, they're not just working to maintain the right to own slaves, they also support strong states' rights. So this means that their government is decentralized. So if you don't have a strong centralized government, it's very hard for you to amass the funds and have that kind of bureaucracy to organize a really strong military. So how does the war actually begin? This isn't actually a battle, Fort Sumter, but it's the first instance of conflict. So it's important to address, even though there's actually no casualties. So Fort Sumter was a Union military fort, but it was in Charleston, South Carolina. So the problem is that there's this little area in South Carolina that's still controlled by Union forces. But we know that South Carolina seceded in 1860. So basically this fort is controlled by the Union Army, but it is surrounded by Confederate territory. So it kind of, I would hope, goes without saying why the Confederacy attacks Fort Sumter. They want to maintain control of the fort for themselves, so they get rid of that Union presence that's in the middle of their territory. So, like I was saying before, what happens is that the Confederacy attacks Fort Sumter, but there are no casualties. So it's, again, not really seen as a battle, but the reason why it matters is because this still was an act of violence upon Union territory. So this really prompts the war because after this attack, it gives Abraham Lincoln much more of the ability to justify retaliation against the South. So really, after Fort Sumter, the U.S. and the Confederacy are officially at war. Okay, so this is just a map that shows you the different locations of major Civil War battle sites. So we see that many of the battles are located on the eastern seaboard. That a number of really crucial battles were located around the Richmond area. Richmond was the capital of the Confederate States of America, so the early Union campaign is focused on trying to seize Richmond because they see that as an easy way to defeat the South. But also, there are many conflicts that extend far west into the Mississippi River region. So, arguably, the South is spread pretty far in terms of the territory it's trying to protect. And eventually, as the war goes on, the North is going to take advantage of that, and they're going to engage in a series of conflicts along the Mississippi River. And eventually, the North will be successful. And so, what happens is the North basically divides the Confederacy in half when they take control of the Mississippi River, which we will get to. All right, so the first major battle of the Civil War, it has two names. Sometimes we call it the Battle of First Bull Run, and it's also called the Battle of First Manassas. So this is on July 21st, 1861. And so the goal is for the Union to march into the Confederate capital in Richmond. So Lincoln thinks that this is the quickest way to achieve victory, right? Once they seize the Confederate capital, the Confederacy will most likely surrender. So what's interesting, though, is this really shows us how this is not going to be a quick war. And there are subsequent series of other battles that take place in this area that prove that even more. So there's going to be a significant resistance by the Confederates to drive the Northerners off. And one of the most famous figures in the first battle of Bull Run is this man, Stonewall Jackson, because it is said that he stood like a stone wall to stop the Union forces from pushing into Richmond. So what we're going to see is that, first of all, because the Union is unsuccessful in getting towards Richmond in Bull Run, it kind of shatters the Union's notions that the war is going to be quick, right? Both sides very quickly realize that they need a stronger military. So Lincoln's going to quickly try to gain more troops. He calls for 500,000 troops immediately. And this is also interesting because we see that in terms of the casualty rate, neither side is particularly far off from one another. So again, this shows us that the South's military leadership is really significant and the North should take it seriously. So what we're seeing here is that, first of all, the sort of monopoly over the cotton industry, and also, again, the strong military leaders of the South are certainly going to give the North a run for their money. Again, just looking at these military battle sites, so First Bull Run is here, and Richmond is here, so they are unsuccessful in getting that far. And since it's been a little while, this video has a good amount of meat to it, I'm going to continue by talking about the Battle of Fredericksburg in a future video. Okay, thanks.